Good afternoon. Al-Mu'taz, Abla, Muhammad, everybody who's gathered here today, welcome. Amira Sonbol, a name that for many of us instantly evokes the essence of curiosity and challenge. She did not just study history. She unraveled it, rewrote it, and dared us all to question it. I have come to learn that we all find our own path to appreciating Amira. Some as her students, others as her colleagues. For me, it was through seeing the many, many lives she touched in our community. While we could speak endlessly of her brilliance as a scholar, what truly stands out to me is not just what she taught, but how she taught it. Amira had a unique gift. She made the complex simple, the distant close, and the forgotten unforgettable. Today, we honor her life and legacy alongside those who knew her best. These distinguished deans worked with her at GU-Q and experienced firsthand her indelible impact on this institution and beyond. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Ahmad Dallal, Gerd Nonneman, Mehran Kamrava, and Clyde Wilcox, all former deans of GU-Q. So let me start by saying, I'm jealous. I'm envious of each of you because you had the honor, the privilege, the pleasure of working with Amira and having her on your faculty when you were deans. I had her on my faculty, but I've been here for 2 years, and those before she passed away earlier this year, she had been teaching remotely and out of Cairo. So I deeply regret not having had the opportunities that you did. So I'm going to try to get closer to Amira vicariously through you, okay? Up here it says she's a founder, scholar, and mentor. And it's a tall order to really touch on her scholarship, teaching, and influence. But we're going to try to do that through the lens of Amira's enduring legacy. These were the core components, core elements that defined her. It's a tall order, but there is much to be said here, and we're going to try to do that as best as we can. So as former deans, who were also her colleagues and friends, we're all eager to hear about the impact that she had for you. And I'm going to start by asking you, Ahmad. Ahmad was dean from 2016 until 2020, no, 15 to 19. 17 to 21, okay. You forget it, okay. Clyde Wilcox was a professor of international politics, of American government, was interim dean between Ahmad's tenure and mine. And before that, before Ahmad, Mehran Kamrava was interim dean between Gerd, Nonneman, and Ahmad. So,
What the reverse?
what's that?
Mehran was before me. And
Mehran was before you and after you?
No, not after.
Just before him? Too many deans, okay. I realized, Ahmad, I had an epiphany a couple of months after I started my job. I said, I'm the 5th dean in 7 years, right? So these are the 4 that make us 5. Okay, so I'm gonna start with you, Ahmad. Ahmad is currently, as Ruqayya said, president of the American University in Cairo, And I know that he's interacted with Amira in many, many different levels. Let's start by talking about his scholarship. And I'm interested in knowing the lasting effects that her scholarship and body of work had not only on GU-Q, but on the way that we engage with critical questions, how it has affected your own approach to your scholarship, and anything else you want to share.
It's good to be back here. Thank you for inviting me. It's good to be celebrating with all of you the memory of a dear colleague, scholar, educator, institution builder, someone we really all cared about in many different ways. And if you allow me just to say a couple
Please.
of general words in the beginning before addressing the question of, when I was first invited and before I knew the structure, I started writing, because there is so much to write about Amira, of course. So I'll draw on some of the things, some of my thoughts. Amira meant different things to many of us in many different ways. And she really was, and especially for this campus, from this location, this particular location, she was part of the core team that built this institution. I personally met Amira way back in a professional context, through Georgetown. I will not talk about the early encounters with Amira. Many of you know that Amira can be feisty, but I got to know her very quickly. I got to know her on a personal level, and we became very close friends. And I got to appreciate many of her multiple talents and traits. I think we will say similar things. We all are talking about the same person, although we experience our relationship with her as diverse. But we will also say, we'll say similar things, but we'll say different things about Amira. But I really think that in a way, the most important thing about this gathering is not what we will say about her, and not the way we will remember her, but it's the fact that we're here. Mm-hmm. We're all here together. I think Amira would have appreciated that. If she were to be in this room, she would be smiling. I mean, she would have appreciated the fact that she had an impact, that her dedication to her colleagues, to her friends, to her students, to her profession is appreciated by the people that she really cared for. Another thing that I would like to say, from early on, almost throughout my career here at Georgetown, and even before, at a certain age, we talk about our retirement. When are we going to retire? Where are we going to retire? What are the projects we want to work on when we retire, and so on.
Maybe at your ages.
Yes, at our age. Yes. And I had these conversations many times with Amira. At one point, I told her, "You will not retire." I mean, it was quite clear that Amira will work till endlessly, to the end. I now say the same thing to my wife. My wife says, "So what are plans for retirement?" I'll tell her I don't want to retire. But in this conversation, one thing struck me all through. She insisted, she told me early on after I joined Georgetown, she told me that she's ready to retire and she wants to think about retirement. But she wants to make sure that the people that she cared about are well taken care of. And she really meant it. Mm. She takes things personally. I see many faces here. You don't know this. She advocated for you. She was your champion. She talked to me about many of you, many of the faces that I actually see in this audience. She would come, she will tell me the work they're doing is important. We need to take care of them. We need to advocate for them. We need to provide them for the space to grow professionally. She really knew people closely. She thought about them. She conceptualized their relationship with them, and she advocated for them. And believe me, I haven't, of course, and I will not tell you specifically about the conversations we've had about many of you here in this audience, but I promise you, she advocated for everyone. She really, that's a character, that's something that characterized Amira Sonbol Azhari, or is it Azhari Sonbol? Azhari Sonbol. Everyone says, and I've heard it this morning, everyone says that work was everything for Amira. It was. Work was extremely important for Amira. The work that she did, there was a sense of dedication in what Amira did. It meant something to her. But Abla and Mu'taz meant a lot to Amira. And from early on, I learned about you. I mean, when we talked about her potential, possible, impossible retirement, one of the key concerns is Abla's career. Where is the best place for Abla to grow? And Mu'taz's tennis, passion for tennis, and he practices tennis every morning, and we have to be in a place where he could pursue his passion for. I learned about these things. Of course, there are many more things that I didn't learn about, but I learned about these things from Amira, and that was a key concern. She loved her family, but she also treated her community, her colleagues, as an extension of that family, and she cared for them and loved them. Now, to go back to your question, do you still want me to answer
We
it?
can go back to that a little bit later. This was beautiful.
All
this
right.
was beautiful, and thank you for it. And you could tell also how much Muhammad, Abla's husband, loves Amira, and we know how much she loved you. I mean, and I think what Dean Dallal, President Dallal, has shared with us is really beautiful, right? When your work is not work, your work is not a job, it's part of your life, and your life is dedicated to the legacy that you're creating at home and through your work and through the students. And it stops being work when you think of your community as your family, right? When you think of the students. I mean, sometimes people ask me, how many kids do I have? And I say, thousands. Really, they all become your kids. So Gerd, I know you also knew her as a teacher. I mean, first, actually, you know what? Let me change course, and let's do what Ahmed has set the precedent for, and that is share with us something memorable, sort of what Amira means to you. How do you look back at her? And then we'll go back and we will talk about her various roles. But what comes to your mind?
When I arrived to take up the deanship back in 2011, so it's a while ago, there were two things I suppose we had in common. One, we were both, I suppose, legally rooted in DC, in the Georgetown DC campus, had a professorship there, and came here to carry it out. I mean, she actually genuinely was a DC professor and had been for years, whereas I actually joined right here, and I just had some status in DC. But the point is, she brought that whole history, that whole knowledge, the deep understanding of what Georgetown really is, since before it was established here, and regularly referred back to it and reminded us of it and what it meant for what we're trying to do here. So that was one thing that she brought that, and she chose to be here. She valued being here, teaching here, doing research about the country and the region here, rather than on the hilltop in DC. So there were several chances for her to go back, but each time she chose to stay here.
And she came here the year this campus was founded. In
Precisely.
2005.
So I didn't see the artwork before I walked in, and I thought, how fitting. Because that's the thing that she also brought to me. There were a few very, very small band of pioneers who'd come out here before this building existed and set the thing up, and actually built a family as well. And there is some of that the spirit is still here. So that's the kind of one of the biggest things that struck me about her. That she was this founder. She brought the DC spirit. She was a pioneer, and she was part of that building a local family here operation. So that was, and the whole institutional memory. So that was one thing that was incredibly valuable for me. And of course, I kind of, in a sense, not in every sense, but in one sense, I saw a kindred spirit when I myself, after my decanal days, had the option of going to DC, which many people, even some of you who saw me today, said, "Oh, where are you now?" And it's, well, I'm here, of course. I chose to be here for similar kinds of reasons. I maybe there's a whole number of things I could say, but sometimes, and I think you did it over lunch as well, people remind us of the meaning of the name Amira in Arabic, right? And it's, of course, in Anglophone societies, it's translated as princess. The trouble is, she was not a princess as in, European folklore. She was a true Amira. In other words, a ruler, the first, the commander. She had a commanding presence, right, in every sense, which sometimes means you bump up to her, and metaphorically, and it would be very serious debates and discussions and so on, but it all came from that sense of leadership, passion, dedication. So I'll just say one more thing at this point. I think that the one thing that really sticks with me was she couldn't come to campus. There was some mobility issue at the time, so she was in her apartment. But she said, "Look, I want to talk to you." This was probably my second year, or towards the end of my second year here. "I want to talk to you. We really need to talk." Okay, I said, "Okay, you know what? I'll come visit you." I went to her place, and she sat me down. And basically, amongst a number of other things which were interesting about the history, about Georgetown and so on, and about colleagues and students that she cared about, so that's again what you said, she said, I'm worried about you. Because you're working so hard, you're always out there and this and that and organizing and restructuring, and you need to see your colleagues, you need to be visible, come be present, right? She was basically saying I had forgotten, I had lost touch, in a sense that I forgot that by doing all this stuff I was losing something very important. And she reminded me of that, the importance of being visible, or visible in the corridors, in people's offices. I thought I was doing it, but clearly not enough at that by that stage. And that was incredibly valuable. And I tried to take it to heart. And I'll leave it there for now.
That's great. Thank you. Yeah, I guess, we have the Arabic faculty over here. I see Hannah and Yusuf. Amira, sort of what it's drawn from, the name, the etymology of it. Amira, Al-Amir, Kaman, right? Okay, the one in charge. Now they're nodding in agreement. I don't know if they're just being nice to me. Mehran, talk to us about your lasting, sort of what comes to your mind when you think of Amira, and again, you were here and you were dean in the early days. Loved what Gerd shared about her bringing the Georgetown spirit and soul and tradition over here, and helping really found the ethos of this place. But whatever you'd like to talk about.
Well, absolutely. As you know, I came here to serve as the director of CIRS, Center for International and Regional Studies. And back then, as we've now restarted doing, CIRS was holding conferences, major conferences. And the very first conference, I had just arrived and didn't really know the lay of the land. And Amira and I sat down in the LAS building before we had moved here, back in 2007. And she said, the notion of innovation in Islam is quite a contentious issue. And why don't you have a conference on innovation in Islam? And we sat down and we literally worked out an entire plan to come up with a conference on innovation in Islam. And Amira gave me a list, and it was a who's who of luminaries in Islamic studies. And I thought to myself, these guys will never come. And actually, because of her involvement, literally every single person who was on the list accepted our invitation. And we were pleased, Professors Nelly Hanna, who's here for this occasion from Cairo, was part of that conference, as was our own Professor Patrick Lowe. And so it was an amazing conference. We held it at the Four Seasons Hotel. And Adonis, the famous Syrian poet, was the keynote speaker. And Sheikh Amosa came, and she was so taken with this conference and the theme and the caliber of discussion that she asked if we could arrange a special meeting of the invited speakers and her private discussion, which was chaired by, co-chaired by me and Amira. And it was an amazing experience, and it really helped lay the solid foundations that we have today of CIRS. It was an amazing experience. It set the standard for everything else that CIRS and Georgetown did at that stage. And we also had speaker series. We used to call it regular monthly dialogue, and now it's called, I think, a dialogue series. And I turned to Amira and I said, Amira, I don't know anybody. I don't know who to invite here in town. And Amira, being Amira, she said, don't worry. And I kind of said, Amira, will you help me out? She gave a speech. She was the first speaker ever of the CIRS monthly dialogue series. And we had it in the library of the LAS building. And I still remember the wisdom of what she said. The gist of her talk, this is back in 2007, and me being as old as I am, I tend to forget things. But I still remember the wisdom of what she said, which is women in Islam had significant rights, which were then messed up by the men's capture of the state. And those rights were eroded and undermined. And that wisdom was symbolic of the depth of her understanding, and it really helped us lay an incredible foundation on which we, other speakers then had to live up to Amira's talk. So she was a force, and she was just an absolute supporter when I was dean those 2 years. Unlike others, she and I didn't really bump heads. She was always there in my corner supporting me. And she supported me against the Washington campus, which all deans need often.
Thank you, Mehran. So many thoughts are going through my head as I'm listening to you. I mean, one is women and Islam, and the first conference, I did not know that the first major conference that SEERS hosted was on that, innovation in Islam. And I'm sure she would be very happy to see what Professor Suhaira Siddiqui has done with the launch of Mujadala and the focus on religion, Islam, and women, and women's scholarly role also in the development theologically. But I was also thinking about women and their role, and how fortunate I am, because these are, to my right, are the men who set the foundation, who really, it's on your shoulders that I ride. And I mean that because you did everything to get the university to where it is today. We're missing, obviously, the late James Reardon Anderson, who passed away last year. He would have been the 6th dean. But I wonder what Amira would think of a stage that's all men. And so let's hope for a future where there will be a woman dean. Not anytime soon. I'm not planning on going anywhere. So Clyde, you must have known Amira on the main campus, right? And then when you came here, you found her here again. Tell us about your memories. What are your reflections?
So I did know Amira in DC slightly. We served on a committee together that awarded grants for summer funding for faculty. It was a very competitive program, and we had grant proposals from physics and poetry and mathematics and all across the board. What just totally blew me away about her was how well she understood every proposal. She had spent so much time digging into, what is important about this proposal. I'm reading it quickly, I'm thinking, okay, this is kind of a cool physics innovation. She says, no, this is the part of the theory that's interesting. So she'd done a lot of work. When I came here, I wasn't sure, am I going to come or not? She actually persuaded me in part to come here. I said that I was interested in coming because teaching was getting stale in Washington. And she said, then you must come here. And just the enthusiasm she had for the students. This is what the students need. This is how they need to grow. Just on and on for 2 hours when I first met her. And helped me then decide what I wanted to teach. I then, in a sense, became a student of hers for a while because I taught women in politics and I taught religion in politics, but I don't know anything about women in Islam. I teach American politics. And so every time I would see her, she would say, well, come into my office. I want to tell you something more. And I would sit and listen. It was fascinating stuff, right? And so, in a sense, I got a chance to be her student as well. And then she helped me set up the mentoring committee, and she was such an advocate for junior and even associate professors. She would come to me and say, I think this faculty member is struggling with their teaching. Can you just go and watch them? And then I would come and tell her what I saw, and she said, can you go back again? And look at their book proposal. And she just, honestly, I think she thought she was the mother of this university, right? The mother of the faculty, the mother of the students. So I knew her briefly as a dean, but as a colleague and a friend, she was very, very important.
Thank you, Clyde. His scholarship, but not only his scholarship, and what you thought of it and how it may have impacted you, or what was unique maybe, or different, or outstanding perhaps in the way that she approached questions, that she approached areas that she was intellectually curious about.
I think the way, the way you articulate the question is very head-on. Amira's early work is on the medical profession in Egypt. She has a famous book, The New Mamluks. She worked on general Islamic history and historiography, but then the biggest impact she's had is in the area of women's studies. She has done in-depth work in multiple books and articles she has published, where she looks at the historical experience, the actual lived historical experience of women, and she compares this historical experience to the normative Islamic approach to women. So this is one aspect, normative versus actual lived historical. But she also looks at this through time. And she looks at the evolution of these, both the practices as well as the normative systems. And she compares the pre-modern to the modern. Some of the lasting sort of ideas that she worked on and that are quite compelling in her field, and I happen to agree with her fully on these things. First, the notion that modernity is always good and there is progress, that's very problematic. And she actually demonstrated through documentary, in-depth, patient documentary work. She worked on Ottoman archives in Egypt and Palestine and Jordan and so on, but primarily in Egypt. She looked at court documents, massive, tons of documents she examined, and she also drove and directed her students to do similar work in similar areas. She demonstrated, and I see some people nodding, she demonstrated that through irrefutable evidence what the actual historical practice looked like and how that compares to the normative systems. But she also looked again at the evolving historical experiences, and she demonstrated, as was mentioned by my colleagues, by Mehran, she demonstrated that modernity brought about, mainly because of the men's taking over the state, but in very complex ways. That's one way of putting it. She demonstrated that the modern legal systems that have been influenced by legal systems that were borrowed from elsewhere, that the modern legal systems actually represented a setback in terms of women's rights. She demonstrated through irrefutable evidence from court documents and otherwise that women participated in the workforce, that this panel wouldn't look like this in pre-modern times, that they traded, they owned property, they engaged in a wide variety of jobs that gradually shrank with the onset of modernity and the systems that modernity brought about, and especially colonial modernity. In that, I think that has been tremendously influential in the field of, and I know that some of the scholars here will talk about this in the next panels in more in depth. I've done the research, I have it here, but I'll let my colleagues talk about it probably much better than I can. Nelly, I know Nelly through Amira. Amira knew about my work, and she told me, you need to meet Nelly and you need to read Nelly, and I did, and she became a guru for me. I was influenced way before I met her in person. I told her that before. But anyway, to come back, I think a primary thing that distinguishes this type of scholarship, aside from the immediate impact, I mean the immediate meaning of this sort of approach and the type of research that she conducted, I think if you want to step back and think about this type of scholarship, I think, to use the words of a colleague that I highly respect, actually to use his exact specific works, understanding precedes method.
Understanding precedes methods.
You need to engage with the actual material to have a meaningful understanding of the context, the historical context, which is evolving, which is messy. It's never as neat as method suggests. We need to have knowledge of the methods. We need to use these tools, and she did. And she actually questioned some of the methodological underpinnings. For example, she questioned the famous Weberian notion of a judge court and so on, of the Islamic legal system and its problematic nature and so on. We need to do that, but we do that in light of what we learn from actual lived experiences, from the actual historical record, and that's something she delved into. And that's a methodological approach that will distinguish this field. Of course, beyond that, so there is the immediate results of her research, there is the methodological framework in which she did her research, and then, as you all know, she ensured the sustainability of the field of women's studies and gender studies. She was the founding member of Hawa, and so she worked on multiple registers.
Right.
She did the in-depth research. Her approach was methodologically distinct and compelling, but she also ensured that there are setups and structures that we all benefit from, and many of the people here in this room benefited from, that actually set the framework for a sustainable work and research on women's studies.
She cared deeply about the questions that she asked,
Absolutely.
right? I mean, which humanized the work that she did,
Of course.
because it brought her lived experiences into it, and she followed a hunch, right, and then applied the methods and so on to see where that would lead her.
So there is a deep sense of purpose in what she did. She
Yeah,
really,
a
it
deep
meant
sense of
something.
purpose,
She knew
right.
that she's working on something that makes a difference.
Yeah. Mehran, I'm going to come back to you. And, Gerd talked about when she sat him down and she gave him Very important lesson, right, in leadership about visibility and access and having one's ears and eyes, close to where things are. When you worked with her at Sears and you led Sears and you led the university also, you're a leader in many, many respects. What did you learn from her about leadership? How did she influence you?
Empathy. I learned from her that you can always humanize, even if you need to make difficult decisions. And even if you need to deliver difficult news, you need to do it in a human way, in a not just humane way, but in a humanly manner. And empathy was, I think, anyone who knew her always knew Amira was first and foremost a loving person. And so what I learned from her is that you could be you could make tough decisions and you could deliver tough news, but you need to do it with empathy and in a human way.
Clyde, often, sorry? Yeah, I mean, oftentimes a person leaves, a scholar, unresolved questions, right? That spark debate, after they're gone. When you think about her work, her scholarship, I know you were not that close to it, but you were close enough. You didn't teach women in Islam, but women in politics and so on, and you were a user of her, the outcomes of her scholarship and her research and so on. If you were to predict, over the next decade or two, maybe beyond even, what kind of questions did she leave behind that would be taken up by by current and future generations of scholars? It's a tough question. I'm putting you on the spot, but that's okay.
I'm exactly the wrong person to ask that question to,
Okay.
because I don't do research that's in any way related to what she does. But I did read some of her research, and the things that came across to me was really careful attention to detail, right? A kind of a neutral scholarship that had fire underneath it. There was a commitment to what she believed in, and she's going to be fair as she does the scholarship, but there's a passion for why she's studying that topic. As to what topic she would cover next, these guys know way better than me on that, but I did admire the scholarship simply for the carefulness, the balance, but also the fire.
If I could just
Please,
add to
yes, I
that,
was gonna
because the careful attention to detail is something that is one of the last lessons that I was reminded of by Amira. She wasn't here, she was already teaching remotely a few years ago, and I had written something on Iranian history, and not being a historian, I had lots of doubts about the depth of what I had written. So I emailed Amira and I asked her if she would be kind enough to read it and give me comments on it. And as you know, Amira was a world-class historian who specialized in archival research. And she wrote back to me after she had read the piece. It was a piece on political history of Iran, of recent Iranian, of Iran from the 1800s on. And in her characteristic way, Amira said, maybe you should turn this into a work of political science. because it just didn't cut muster with her. It just wasn't good enough as a work of history. There was no archival research. I had, and she did say, she said, you're using a lot of secondary sources. I actually questioned my own wisdom about having emailed her to begin with, because it didn't have the careful attention to detail that she demanded of her own research.
Right. And that's exactly the kind of person that you want reviewing your work and giving
Absolutely. Yeah.
you the honest advice. Can we talk about her as a teacher?
Can
Yeah,
I maybe
please.
just say something about the research, not so much in precisely what or the method she used and so on, although we all know that attention to detail, the archival stuff. But what I really admired, and I think what a lot of her students loved, she would take them to the archives herself, right? They'd go around various places in Qatar, even before it was all brought together in QNL, the Qatar National Library, and do this detailed work, really the grindstone stuff. That's what UNESCO, that inspires, that teaches method, but it inspires. And I've heard secondhand from plenty of students actually that it inspired them, right? So it brings an enthusiasm. So that's something that struck me about that element of research. And the other thing that I think we need to note is she was obviously a socially engaged researcher and historian. She did it for a purpose, and she brought that across to students as well. But she was also about linking to the society she was in, connecting to society in all sorts of ways. Academic networking, through all sorts of activities. For instance, the project on Gulf women was something that also she brought in this network of people and connected it to other people in Qatar, including again Sheikh Hamoza, who was very enthused about it. But it goes beyond it. One example I think at some point I want to mention, so I'll do it now. The first sort of output the first external stories I heard about Amira was before I joined Georgetown, and it was at Qatar University. Because I had a former PhD student who ended up working there, and he told me that in the Department of International Relations, Qatar University established this Department of International Relations, or developed it from what had been a nucleus, and it became a serious Department of International Relations, international politics. She was the one who had been seconded from Georgetown, Qatar, or had taken it on additionally, and she went to pull that department into shape. So she has a kind of legacy that goes well beyond her own narrow focus, her own particular specialisms. She had a broad interest and an absolute passion to engage and make this place relevant for the environment that she was in. So that connection with Qatar University I always thought was incredibly valuable. And good things have happened as a result of the work she did there.
May I follow?
Please, yeah.
Thank you. Building on what Mehran and Gerd said, first of all, I wouldn't frame the question the way you did. It's not what open question she didn't answer. Because if you knew Amira, she had an answer for
everything.
For everything. She will tell you, this is the way it should be, and a week later she will say, I changed my mind. And it should be something else. But she was always clear, and she had a clarity of mind. But the types of questions, because of the way she approached scholarship, because of the way she wanted her scholarship to be guided by actual historical evidence, all of the questions she asked were open-ended. And she urged us all to look at the actual historical evidence before falling. And we work in a field which has so many stereotypes, and it's problematic, it's biased in so many different ways. And her way of dealing with that was to go to the actual historical evidence and to question the frameworks, the theoretical frameworks within which we work. You mentioned her last book on, the work on women, on Gulf women, is pretty much at a phase in Amira's career when she was quite mature in terms of scholarship and so on. But I know, because I've discussed this with her, in reflecting on this book, one of the things she said, I think she even said, she might have said that in writing, I can't remember. But one of the things she said about this book is that she actually discovered new ways of approaching the subject. By mobilizing people who brought multiple new perspectives, she learned that there are, the diversity of approaches and the multiple things that you could discover. And I think that's one of the things she values about that book, because that book It's not just the summary, it's not just a
opened
collection
up
of
a new
articles,
pathway
work
for
which
her
is
to
already
think.
done. It actually opened new venues.
Yeah.
And then, you know, her work in Qatar Foundation, in Qatar University and so on. Amira came, her intention was to spend a year, then it became 3 years, and then she stayed here. It's deliberate, because she was concerned with making a difference and with impact. And her work in Qatar University is actually a reflection of her understanding of her role here.
Yeah.
She wasn't coming to be in an isolated bubble. She's actually one of the pioneers, and I would venture to say in all of Qatar Foundation in the branch campuses, in seeing the value and the importance of engaging with Qatar. Because, you know, we were not parachuted in this place.
Right.
We were invited to this place because of an initiative that came out from this place, and she saw that. And she saw a responsibility to engage with the whole landscape, education and landscape of Qatar, and she built one of the most compelling programs at Qatar University.
Yeah.
Before we even understood what that means.
She was invested in helping
In this place.
organic growth.
Exactly.
here,
Yeah.
which is often, you know, how we look at Qatar University, HBKU, right? We have a responsibility to contribute and to benefit from their presence, and I'm really inspired by hearing you describe how she helped develop the IR discipline at Qatar University. But she couldn't have had an answer to every question, Ahmed.
No, of course not. But it's open-ended.
It's open-ended, exactly.
But she thought she did.
She thought she did.
She would quickly change her mind, but
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
at any one point in time, she thought she did.
I want to give a little bit of time if there are questions from the audience, because you know it's a rare opportunity to have all of you up here. So while you think about questions that you might want to ask, let me come back to my colleagues here with a couple of other questions. We've talked so much about her character, her scholarship, her intellectual resilience, her emotional resilience, right? And how the two really work together and gelled so beautifully to produce the work that she did. We spoke about sort of her mentorship, right? And leadership and so on. None of us was her student. So we will hear in different panels this afternoon about her teaching. But to the extent that you know, or to the extent that you can imagine, what made the students love her? I mean, I didn't know her. I think I was telling Abla before, I met Amira once in another lifetime. I mean, not literally in another lifetime, but when she was still in Washington. And I can't remember the circumstances under which we met, but when I was coming here and I saw the name Amira Sonbol, I said, yeah, I know her. I met her. You know, she's sort of entered my life, but that was it. But I can imagine her in the classroom now. I can imagine her as this person who cared deeply, not only about the questions that she posed, not only about the research that she did, but about her family and her junior colleagues and so on. She was large. She was large, right? So I can imagine probably how she was in the classroom.
So I think of two things, right? From listening to students who volunteer all kinds of things during my years here, and from walking around the corridors more since I stepped down as dean. Of course, that happened more often. I became even more visible. And the thing is, it's two things, I think. Generally, we know she cared, right? That comes through very strongly. She was not just somebody who gave out assignments that you had to try and do well in. That was much broader than that. The one thing is this attention for the actual work of discovery and taking students to these places. That's one thing that inspired. The other thing, I think, was simply the warmth and the laughter. It was, I think, Rogaya mentioned that her office door was always open, and every time I walked past, I wouldn't just see students in there. Sometimes, it was like a party going on, but the laughter would reverberate, right? Both students and her. So that's incredibly powerful. I mean, in the effects it has, but also in what it tells you about the nature of this person and the impact she was having.
She made it fun. She made it fun. Any thoughts, any reflections from any of the rest of you?
Well, you know, I was sort of her student briefly, right, as I'm sitting in. And the thing that came across to me is that she was very passionate about what she was telling me, but she was also really trying to notice whenever I would be missing something, which was actually pretty often because I knew nothing about it. So I think that probably in her classes, she's watching every student to make sure that everyone is getting it, right? And she'd sometimes come to me and say, you have this person in your class. And I'm just noticing that he's not paying attention as much to me. What's going on in your class? So just every student she's caring about.
Maybe to answer the question, a small episode. I used to teach at Georgetown, DC, and I went to AUB. One of my graduate students, some of you might know him, I will not mention the name, of course. I was his primary advisor. He was working in one of my primary fields. And I left, of course, and you know, by policy, you have to have an advisor from the institution. Amira took him on, and she became his advisor, but she really didn't know his field, and so on. Anyway, this particular student dropped out because of a variety of reasons, but he had potential. Eventually, she moved here. I was at AUB, and then I came here, and she was at, she was in DC, and she came here. We both were removed. Student reapplied. It was a big ordeal. We both were involved in getting him reinstated in the university so that he continues the work, but then he didn't have the advice. We've spent hours, Amira and I, and at her request, and at her initiative, trying to figure out what to do to help him. Wow. And eventually he wrote an excellent dissertation. He was, for all practical purposes, about to be dismissed again because he didn't have the guidance. She's the type of person who takes responsibility. She identifies talent in students, and she feels accountable. She feels responsible for their success. This is not something we all have, by the way. Some of us are more interested in their own scholarships for understandable reasons, and they give a chance to the student. If they don't deliver, it's their problem.
They move on.
She doesn't act like this. She takes it on. It's personal to her, till the bitter end. And this is I know of this particular example because we spent hours working on this particular case, on and off, and eventually the student graduated.
Yeah,
and
but
wrote an excellent dissertation.
Where is that student now?
He's in California. He's teaching in California.
But you know what I learned from listening to that episode, and you know, I'm getting to know your mother, Abla. I mean, really, just through hearing about her and appreciating the kind of person that she was, she comes across also as an incredibly confident person, right? Very confident, very sure of herself in a very good way. I mean, you said, yes, she always had an answer, or she thought she had an answer. But what you just described in terms of that person that most other people would have given up on, she saw something in them, right? And she believed that. And so she believed in him, and she stayed after it. So it's a combination of knowing, right? Being resilient and caring, right? And that's a rare combination. That's something that's very, very enviable to have in a person. She also sounds like the kind of person you need in your life, in your work environment, in life, to keep you honest, right? She keeps you honest.
Yeah.
She keeps you honest. Like when she
summons you.
She summons you, like when she summoned you and when she told you what she thought of her work. And my favorite part, shh, Mama's talking, okay?
That was great.
I'm gonna use that. I'm gonna, use a variation of it, okay? And I'll make sure that the spirit of Amira haunts you, Ruqayya. Any questions from the audience to anything that we did not talk about that you're curious about, that you want to know what a dean who worked with Amira thought of? And it's okay if there aren't any questions. We can continue talking. easily.
contribute.
Ayman,
Or
Professor
comments.
Shabana.
Or comments.
Or comments,
Yeah.
or comments, or comments.
Thank you very much for all your thoughts, and I'm sure everybody here and anybody who knew Professor Sonbol is touched by this gathering. So thank you very much to you and sorry, to the institution for actually doing
I have
this.
the microphone.
This really means a lot to all of us. I can just echo what you all said, and I can testify myself, especially to what President Dallal said about how much she advocated for her colleagues. I mean,
Close.
I have the
Yeah.
microphone, Ayman.
yeah. Yes, she did. She did, and she did it very powerfully and very strongly. Also, what Dean Mehran and Nonneman and Wilcox said about empathy. This is something that we saw and we felt in our interaction with her. So she was really gifted in many things. But I think most importantly for me, that she saw what is best in you, and she brought that out. I remember very vividly that perhaps the first time I saw her when I came here, and I was a newly minted PhD, if you will, and she said, "Oh, your book is very good, is great," and I was really surprised and was, of course, very flattered that, someone of her stature has taken the time actually to look at a book of just someone who just got out of graduate school. So she was this kind of person who gave you confidence. And I really feel lucky that I came to know her, because in life, usually you meet two types of people, right? One that is very casual, that, is not gonna, last with you, or you're gonna forget them somehow. But the other stays with you, right? Because of one thing they said, or a meaningful interaction, or an experience. And definitely she was this kind of person. So thank you again for doing this. And
you,
to the family, of course, we can't just express our appreciation for how much she meant to all of us, and she was really special. So our deep thoughts are with you as well as you grieve, the loss, the passing of Professor Sonbol.
So yes, thank you for doing this.
Can you put the microphone closer to your? Yeah, the acoustics here are not great, so
Is this
you can
better?
speak louder and
It's always
closer.
soft. Go for it.
Yeah, so thank you so much for doing this. أول شيء الله يرحمها ويغفر لها إن شاء الله ويتقبلها. Your conversation about why her student love her, I thought I'd contribute as a student. So Professor Amira to us was someone who provided a safe space. We could come to her office. We discussed anything and everything. We'd have fun. Like you said, we'd have fun in all her classes. It was never a weight on us. It was بالعكس, it was something that we completely enjoyed. We'd always, she'd always see the value in what we do. She said, I learn from you as much as you learn from me, or I learn more from you than what you learn from me. And like Professor Shabana said, gives us so much value, or gives us so much encouragement to do what we want. And she made, personally to me, she made academia so personal, and she made me study things that I thought weren't acceptable academically. And that's not something simple. It really changes my perspective on life and perspective on what I want to do with myself and with my life. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. That was so beautiful. It really was. And it's part of what defines every great teacher, somebody who believes that they are there to facilitate a learning experience for everybody, including themselves. Anyone else? Any other comments or questions? Yes, please.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته ورحمة الله الأستاذة الدكتورة أميرة سنبل. I would like to talk about my experience as her student at AUC in my first semester of the graduate program. It was really a great experience, and I had this honor. And I remember her how she taught us about the Islamic movements. It was a course in history about Islamic movements, and we were invited to her home in one of the sessions as a whole class. So we had this great relation with her, and God bless her soul. Allah yarhamha wa yahsan ilayha. So I just wanted to mention her experience at AUC as well.
Thank you. I can't thank you enough. Yes, sorry. Yeah, okay, Ian, and then I'll ask each of you to say something.
I just want to say, as a colleague, what I remember about her most of all was her principles. You know, like in academia and even in life, people often argue from their own narrow, petty self-interest. You know, they have their own interests, their own agendas. But, you know, regardless of whether you agreed with them or disagreed with them, Amira did have principles, and she fought with them, and she was a fighter. And if she was on your side, it was great. And if you were the object of her military campaign, it wasn't so great. But she was a fighter, and she had tremendous energy. And I remember, you know, even in senior corps tenure meetings, you know, she was one of the people who would, if she felt some kind of ethical thing was being overlooked, she would fight the corner. And academia needs more people like that. It really does. So my deepest condolences to the family here today. But I genuinely sort of remember her fondly as a colleague.
Thank you, Ian. Just go around, and if there are any final thoughts any of you has.
There's a comment.
Oh, there's one more. Okay, we'll take that and then.
I was دكتورة سنبل student. أولاً الله يرحمها ويغفر لها ويتقبلها. I graduated from here in 2015, and I remember someone walked up to me once and they said, "You're taking Professor Sonbol again? This is your 9th class with her." And I never regretted a single class, and I still talk about her and the stuff that she taught to us wherever I go, any job, any academic space, non-academic space, because the lessons she taught us were truly, truly meaningful. I mean, when we were writing our papers, it really wasn't just scholarship or academia. The ideas she would encourage each one of us to explore were tailor-made to our personalities, to our experiences. And she identified those because she cared about each and every one of us so deeply. It's not an exaggeration to say that she really was a mother and a teacher to us. And whenever we try to remember or think about what she did, it just goes beyond so much of discussing ideas or papers or stuff like that. So a discussion that would start in class would end up in her office, and then she would invite a few of us in there, and she would ask us how we felt about it the next day. But she embodied these ideals as well. You know, we saw it as a person that when you write about social justice, when you write about feminism, when you write about Islamic law, when you write about anything that she studied, she was the embodiment of that. And I think that's what encouraged us to just not take these lessons as mere words we write on a paper, but as how to walk in this earth, how to really bring that mission to life. And for that, I'm profoundly grateful. And my heart is with the family. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. Thank you.
Anything?
I was proud, and I remain proud to be affiliated with an institution in which she was a professor.
I'll just say, you know, apart from the fact that I learned from her, and I loved hearing that laughter around the corridors, and that we had our fights, which were always, you know, she could be feisty. she made an impact, right? She made a massive impact, like we just heard from one of our alumni. She made an impact on the institution as a whole. She made an impact across Education City into Qatar University. She made an impact in other circles in society here and across the region. So all of that, she was an Amira in the true sense, but one with kindness behind all the strength.
Thank you.
So when I told Amira I was going to be here for a year, she said, "Don't kid yourself." She said, "You're going to find the students are so exciting that you will learn from them, that they will learn from each other, and it's a wonderful experience." And I thought, you're out of your mind. And here I am, so.
Yeah. That's impact.
Monsieur.
You know, we're living at a time of great loss. You know, there is massive trauma and destruction around us everywhere. First Gaza and Palestine, and now Lebanon. And it makes you feel that life is fleeting, but then a life well lived will always be remembered. So examples like Amira give us hope.
You know, Gerd, you said the impact that she's had, it's a lasting impact. Mm-hmm. It's a lasting impact, and everything that we've talked about, everything we've discussed here, makes me convinced that her legacy, her spirit, will live on, and it will live on for generations to come through the lives that she touched and through the lives that these lives are going to touch. Mm-hmm. I feel privileged to be sharing the stage with you, to learn about Amira the way that I have learned this afternoon. I look at her and, you know, there's something that's incredibly inviting about her. You know, she draws you in. She draws you in. And I feel drawn into her in a very powerful way, even though I didn't have the privilege of working with her or knowing her the way that you did. So I want to thank you for bringing her into my orbit, because now I feel that I am a beneficiary of Amira and the person that I want to say she was, but I want to say she is, that she is. So thank you so very much. Thank you.